Welcome back, everybody, to Quick Hits with BDSA. Wow, we've got a lot to unpack here today, no pun intended, regarding our show MJ Unpacked that we hope to see you all at in October in Las Vegas. But we have our very special guest, Kelly Nielson from BDSA, and to talk today about cannabis and alcohol. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me again.
Of course. So Kelly, BDSA. Let's start north of the border.
Okay.
Because there's so much we can talk about here. BDSA has obviously initiated coverage in Canada, and we're really starting to see the development of beverage category in Canadian market. Why don't you start telling us a little about where that is and where that's headed?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to watch the unfolding of the beverage industry in Canada for a couple of reasons. I think the first is that it is the first market where we really saw big alcohol organizations start to invest in the space, right? So it started, a couple of years ago when we saw the big news about Constellation Brands investing.
It was huge.
It was huge. $190 million or something like that.
It was game-changing news, and Bruce Linton was running Canopy Growth at the time, and everybody stopped and said, "They're coming."
Yep, exactly. And I think that's, that was the first of many, where since then you've seen Molson Coors, you've seen ABI InBev really start to enter the space as well. And so
PBR, baby, PBR.
And PBR, yeah, exactly. So it's not just the big guys, it's not just the small guys at this point, it really is everyone getting into the space. And I think, what that's really meant is it's been a really exciting evolution for the products in Canada versus maybe what we see in the United States, because, in the Canadian market, they kind of had a chance to get in and see what the US maybe didn't do right the first couple of years of cannabis beverages, if we go back 5-10 years. But they also come with a wealth of knowledge about what it takes to brew great product or develop great liquids, which is really exciting for not just the companies that are entering the space, but also the consumer.
Sure. I mean, listen, the beverage category is probably one of the most capital intensive products that you can create from kind of the ingestible category, as BDSA, kind of groups them as. You obviously have a lot of bottling equipment. You've got, packaging. Tin has been, difficult to secure for stuff that is lined properly so that it can be shelf stable. And then the transport costs on top of that. Obviously, you're moving a lot of liquid, so
and then just getting it on the shelf. It takes up so much space versus, say, a little package of pre-rolls or something along those lines, right? It requires that much more capital to produce it, that much more expertise to produce it, and then also that much more shelf space to drive awareness to consumers.
Well, and no disrespect to our brethren to the north, but I certainly love talking about the U.S. market. I mean, we love beverages here, right? And we have convenience stores with like 42 cases with like 500 products of beverages we can choose from. We like to drink things.
Yep.
And so, talking about the U.S. market, when we were chatting earlier, it was interesting to see in the very early days of, kind of the adult use markets in Colorado and Washington, Oregon, a lot of times the products that were available, it was a college dorm fridge that was underneath the counter. It wasn't in eyesight. And the dosages on these were 100 milligrams per, 12 or 16 ounce bottle. Certainly designed, I think, more for the medical patient than the recreational user. But I always kind of scratch my head, like, who wants to buy a bottle and I'm going to have a sip tonight and I'm going to have a sip tomorrow, right? We're taught to guzzle. What is it, like 120 ounces, the big gulp at 7-Eleven that you see people carrying around?
Yep.
So, what are you seeing a lot? Obviously we've got a lot of evolution in the product category. What are some of the exciting things you see there?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head first is in terms of what we're seeing from this dosage perspective, right? That I think some of those larger format, high milligram bottles, it wasn't meeting the US consumer expectation of a beverage. When you think about what we do with beverages, alcohol or non-alcohol, exactly as you mentioned, that it's more of over a long period of time, I get to drink or enjoy my large quantity of product, which you can't do with a high milligram content bottle. I think the other thing, and when it starts to play into the alcohol beverage space, if you think about those 100 milligram, or in some cases, more than that, bottle of cannabis product, it's just a completely different occasion than maybe what we would consider a typical alcohol drinking occasion, which tends to be more social in nature, which, something like that is, quite frankly, probably going to impact people to a point where they're not going to be wanting to hang out with people on a social occasion, right?
You can have a very antisocial social behavior in house. Everybody chug 100 milligrams of beverage, and
Exactly.
everybody's sitting in the corner curled up in the fetal position by the end of the night.
Yeah, which I think brings us to, some of the trends that we're seeing in the alcohol cannabis space, or excuse me, the cannabis beverage space, which the first is lower dose products. And seeing products with maybe 2 milligrams of CBD up to about 5 or 10 milligrams, or THC, excuse me. And in some cases also CBD, right? So for example, what is it, 2.5 milligrams of THC, right, with 4 milligrams of CBD. And they're telling you that this is something that's designed to make you feel how you want to feel in a social occasion, maybe akin to having a glass of wine or a beer, but without the hangover.
But also the technology behind that, right? With the nano-emulsification and really being able to kind of, this has been the holy grail in a lot of cases of the kind of cannabis product to kind of mirror the intoxication profile of alcohol. And you talk at BDSA a lot about, instances and occasions, and but people can then go have multiple instances of consumption of that product. Some nights I might want to go out and have 3 or 4 beers. Some nights I might want to just have one. And I get to choose, kind of how I want to stack that experience or that intoxication or recreational event as an adult to unwind the stresses of my day.
Yeah.
But most of this is still at home consumption, right? There's a big chunk of the market that's missing that I think also is probably our biggest knife to cut into alcohol, right? And that's on-premise consumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think just unpacking that a couple one by one, like you're absolutely correct. The technology behind beverages is really interesting because we're seeing beverages have the inherent additional benefit compared to a traditional edible that you're going to feel it faster. It has faster onset. And so that in itself makes it more akin and more viable for maybe a social occasion and those occasions when you want to experience cannabis in a little bit faster rate. And then, to your point on premise, it's really interesting because in certain markets, California, for example, you are seeing maybe cannabis paired dinners and those sorts of things start to pop up. I'm going to give a shout out to Chef Stacy. I haven't seen her or talked to her for a while, but she did a pop-up dinner here in Seattle a long time ago. And it was using a nano-emulsified liquid cannabis product. And she just infused it with the sauces over the course of the meals. What was really awesome about that is that you pre-ordered your dosage for the night. So if I wanted a 10 milligram dinner, somebody wanted a 50 milligram dinner, they had, 10 vials, I had 2 vials, and she dosed them accordingly. Maybe mine got mixed up because I had a really good time that night. I think that's the intent.
Yeah.
But I think, I think something that is interesting is that right now, if you're experiencing those pop-ups in a lot of circumstances, not all, but, or if this is the case, they're probably skirting around some rules, is that, we're not really supposed to have or create alcohol product and cannabis product in the same location. So there's ways around it, and you kind of build product or make product in separate locations, bring it to a spot. You're not technically selling either of them. So there's some ways to kind of skirt around that. But I think that when it comes to the long-term viability or the long-term potential of an on-premise cannabis industry, that is something that folks are going to have to grapple with. It's like, would we have to be forcing folks to choose between cannabis and alcohol in those circumstances?
Yeah, well, and listen, multiplier effect. I know from experience that, if I've been drinking and then have some cannabis, that I certainly am a little bit more intoxicated than I would be if I had eaten one on a separate occasion. But we're seeing the development of these social consumption lounges. Nevada is making a lot of progress towards this. California's had some successes, some failures. Colorado. But when we look at what on-premise cannabis consumption looks like, I just really think, you look at the alcohol industry, $200 billion industry in the US, 48% of which is on-premise consumption. So that's going to a dinner and having a glass of wine and going to a lunch and having a martini. or going to a tavern, nightclub, social lounge, whatever, and consuming alcohol. I think that what's exciting is to see all these great products, like you mentioned before, and we've got companies like Viv and Oak, Bolt Iced Tea, Lagunitas, to Canna Craft, Pabst Blue Ribbon getting in the space. And so, kind of not trying to strip away this last 100 years that we've kind of developed these social habits. And these are habits that, when you talk about it, at the end of the day, it's easier for me to grab, a bourbon or a beer than it is for me to, go roll a joint. Although I'd rather probably roll a joint, and I do, or have an edible. It's just, sometimes it's just convenience and just kind of habit, right? And I know cannabis is better for me physiologically. I know it's going to have less of an impairment on me the next day. But when we look at these social lounges, they're not going to be, big hookah lounges with people, there might be some, but it's not going in there and getting joints and everybody's smoking up and you're in this big hot box, right? That just doesn't seem like an experience that I think most consumers want today. But going to a place where you can have those multiple instances, and is it not just a matter of time before we start seeing something like, Jim Beam's, Granddaddy Purple, and Jack Daniels has their Alien Crack, and it's non-alcoholic, but they can still create that same type of concoction experience with the bartender serving drinks and providing, solutions or different flavors to different consumers.
Well, and I think that's the flavor experience is one where I think we continue to see innovation in the beverage space as it is, right? Like you called out several that, can, for example, Levia also, recently making a pretty big splash in Massachusetts. That these products are, first of all, leveraging trends that we're already seeing in the beverage industry, both within alcohol and outside of alcohol, which is lighter flavors, botanicals, sessionability. And we're seeing those products come to fruition here in the cannabis industry with high quality products and great flavors that people are actually meant to enjoy and sit and, enjoy over time rather than just, take a little shot and be done with it.
Which is also important to realize. I mean, we have made a lot of advances in the product technology and kind of the innovation. A lot of the earlier products had a very, kind of cannabis, bitter kind of tannic taste to them. The way that they were blending, and with this nano-emulsification, you're really eliminating that kind of cannabis taste in the drink, which some people don't enjoy. I'm impartial to it. I kind of like those kind of rich flavors, but and I also saw like Curaleaf. I mean, they took those kind of Mio Sport, drinks where you just squirt the flavoring into your bottle of water, and they've got that product now available as a cannabis product, and it's just taking stuff. I mean, Can didn't invent the seltzer category. The seltzer category was around and was exploding. And they said, wow, this is really big here. If we create this with cannabis, it should be able to sell because it's a shorter jump for the consumer, right?
Well, and I think that you bring up different technologies. I think that we'd be remiss not to call out, some of the powder mixes. If you think about still water and whatnot, because I'm still a fan. I'm still a very big fan.
I love Ripple. I love Ripple. I actually met with some of my investors a couple of weeks ago. And we had dinner, and I had everybody drink a glass of Ripple before dinner started. It's a great night.
But it gives you the flexibility to that type of product, and similar to the liquid editions, it gives you the flexibility to use it how you want it too. So maybe instead of putting it in a seltzer and enjoying those sorts of flavors, it's in some circumstances, my own, it's in a cup of tea before bed. And so you have more flexibility with those sorts of water dissolvable additives as well.
Who else is doing the powdered stuff? I mean, remember they were talking about making powdered alcohol for a while, and it got just massively lambasted in the public opinion poll sphere.
I think there are certain things that just shouldn't be, and I think alcohol consumers still want their big alcohol companies to be making those products. So I think, Stillwater is still the biggest. Ripple's still, pretty dominant in that particular space.
Yeah. I listen, Stillwater, if you're listening to this, can you please set up operations in Washington? I love your product.
And Illinois. Illinois would be fantastic as well.
Illinois, Kelly, hook us up. We don't want to be transporting cannabis across state lines illegally.
Yeah.
All right. So, we've obviously, going back to that kind of development of the category, There's a company, obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with, Space Station, Mackay's company out in California. I mean, they're primarily like the biggest, producer of and bottler of all of these beverages right now, because again, of that huge capital infrastructure that needs to be spent to create these bottling facilities that are regulatorily compliant and kind of also have that intellectual, capability to manage a cannabis brewing process versus an alcohol brewing process and bottling process. And it's somewhat of a limiting factor until we see these types of bottling facilities be built in other states. And I'm sure Space Station has plans to do this in other states. Las Vegas, Nevada would be a great place. I'm sure that at some point in time, we'll be able to consume cannabis beverages in Las Vegas. But, kind of creating that bottling house concept that exists in the canned bottle segment for non-alcoholic beverages or soft drinks, as well as in the brewing space, where you have these third-party contractors that can really create economies of scale for the producers of these products, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now, the production costs, the bottling costs, the transport costs, all those things that we mentioned, they really are prohibitors to making beverages on a large scale across a wide variety of states, as long as we can't ship across state lines, right? And then actually to layer an additional component into that. So a lot of the beverages we've been talking about now, they might be able to stand in their own right as a seltzer or a cola or something along those lines. But, if you start getting into the world of non-alcoholic beer with cannabis in it, or non-alcoholic wine and cannabis, in order to create a product that's actually worthwhile and has the same tastes and flavors as that alcohol product, you actually have to brew it with alcohol, then remove the alcohol. So that's just an additional layer of capital that's needed to brew some of these products.
So Kelly, we'd be a little bit reminiscent. We didn't talk about some of the legacy companies in the space. I mean, Tripp, Keeber, and Chuck Smith, and what they created with Dixie Elixirs. Keef Cola, a great product. It's still pretty big product in the market, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it continues to be the biggest beverage brand in the United States. And I think, what's really interesting there with Keef is they've been able to really expand their geography. And so, yes, they might not necessarily be the number one beverage in any given market, but they've done such a nice job at expanding their geography that when you add up all the volume from all the different states, they continue to be the number one beverage brand in the US.
That's impressive. It's impressive. And listen, up here in the Pacific Northwest, Olala has done a great job, creating a beverage category. But it's also, it's still, again, most of the states have very limited, beverage availability. Can did sign a deal with GTI, so that brings them into 20 more states, if I'm not mistaken.
I forget the exact number, but I know I've definitely started seeing them pop up in Illinois here.
Yeah. So we know that cannabis has a potential of being what's the term, an overlap, but it's also a substitution for alcohol. So we know that the alcohol industry, as you mentioned, Coors, Molson, Constellation brands, my fan favorite, Pabst Blue Ribbon from my hometown of Milwaukee at one point. We're certainly seeing a lot of these companies that have the wisdom to move into the space as an opportunity for continued growth. I know that I've seen reports in the past of seeing alcohol sales decline in some states where cannabis is available. Do you have any insights on that kind of paradigm shift of consumers moving over to cannabis, or are they just more likely to like both?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple things going on. I think the first is that just outside of cannabis for a second, from prior lives and my prior roles, the trends in alcohol are shifting, that people are still looking for better for you. The younger generation is not consuming as much alcohol. And so I think in general, alcohol beverage manufacturers are having to figure out ways to sustain their growth into the future. And so I think more and more you're seeing these companies consider themselves less alcohol companies or beer companies or whatever it is, and more just like general beverage companies. And you continue to see that these companies are expanding their portfolios into the low alc or non-alcoholic segments. And I think the cannabis industry really fits into that, both from regulated cannabis sold through dispensaries, as well as the CBD market, because you do see organizations and big alcohol getting into the CBD industry in the United States already too, right? So I think that it's a natural extension of the organizations because they have the expertise. They're looking to expand their base and bring in a younger consumer as they're turning away from alcohol in its traditional sense. So I think that's the first dynamic. And then when it comes to the occasion based, I think that There's definitely a lot of overlap in the consumer that we can't ignore. That, something that really stuck out to me is that half of alcohol beverage consumers in legal states are cannabis consumers. And that is up from 30% just a couple of years ago. And so we are seeing that more and more folks, and this is just across the board, right? We're seeing the penetration of folks that consume cannabis continue to increase, even in the most mature markets. And so to me, it wasn't all that surprising to see that that number continues to increase. And so I think there's going to continue to be more overlap in the consumer. I do think that today we're still seeing that consumers are making the choice between cannabis or alcohol, though, based on the occasion. That most consumers are telling us that it is not a substitute. They are not both good for the exact same occasions. And I think there's kind of safe spaces for each of them, whereas alcohol is still probably the safer bet for maybe high energy occasions, larger group occasions, public settings, those sorts of things. Whereas cannabis probably much more safe when it comes to if you're trying to be creative or trying to get things done, or in a smaller.
Or golfing. I like cannabis when I go golfing.
Exactly. But I think you bring up a good point that there's a lot of overlap, and the gray area or the spaces that aren't necessarily one or the other are those what I'll call daytime fun. I would consider golfing to be what I would call something like daytime fun, or where it's still a hanging out or lower key occasion, but maybe it expands it outside of the evening occasion. And it's during the day with friends, just hanging out. What do you do in those circumstances, and what do you turn to?
Hey, listen, we all work from home. Day drinking kind of became a thing when COVID hit, and I think that people realized that wasn't sustainable. So maybe that had a lot to do with the spike in cannabis sales. All right, so we've been talking for quite a while, a little bit longer episode than most. Kelly, thank you so much for your time. I got one closing question. How do you feel? How do you think the guys that invented Zima feel about the explosion of the seltzer category, both in alcohol and cannabis? They kick themselves in the ass.
Alcohol beverage. I think they feel about the same way as the guys who spent so much time perfecting an IPA only for there to be hazy IPA is the next new thing. So
yeah,
all this time and effort to build these products only for it to come back around 10, 20 years later.
Sure. The second mouse gets the cheese sometimes. All right, Kelly.
It's all about timing. It's all about timing.
We'll jump into another episode with you in the next couple of weeks. Thank you for your time. Maybe next week, next episode, we can talk a little bit about the Pennsylvania market. I know BDSA has initiated coverage there.
Yes, we have.
And certainly some exciting things happening on the East Coast.
Awesome. Thanks so much, George.
Bye-bye.
Bye.